All right, and we're live. How's it going, Deborah?
It's going well. How are you?
Good, good. Thanks for talking with me today.
You're welcome. I'm excited.
Yeah. So I want to start right from the beginning about how you decided you wanted to become a writer, um, and maybe also how did you end up in Mexico?
So I decided to. I don't know. I kind of loved writing when I was a kid. I recently was writing about the first time I wrote a poem, which was I think when I was about 10 or 12. And I won a competition, and my mum put it on the bathroom wall. Bathroom wall.
Nice.
Um, that doesn't speak to its quality, okay? Um, and then, uh, and then when I was at university in Bristol in England, I did a lot of work for my student newspaper, and a lot of that was interviewing bands and going to gigs and like sort of journalistic review type things, and I very much loved that. And then just like after I left college, looked for a job in journalism, which at the time was not quite as beleaguered as journalism is now. So and the internet was exploding. This was, I'm ashamed to say, back in 1998, 1999 when I graduated. So the internet was just taking hold, and like it was just a very different journalistic scene to what we're seeing now. There was still a lot of print newspapers and what have you. But you know, when I lived in London, I used to go to this club all the time called the Frontline Club, which was where sort of the British equivalents of Dan Rather and Christiane Amanpour would go. You know, Lindsay Hilsum and John Simpson and the stars from the British journalism world would go and launch their books and talk about their travels. And I remember thinking, I don't want to be in London writing about London. I want to be somewhere else writing about somewhere else. Um, which is kind of what brought me to Mexico. I was doing a human rights master's, and I wanted to do the thesis on violence against journalists, which back then and to this very day is still, as you know, a pretty chronic problem. And I came, and like things just took off. I ended up getting work with the LA Times, getting a lot of freelance work back then. At the time, I was kind of doing this one-man band experiment, which now just seems absurd to even make it into a thing. But back then, um, the idea of writers also doing video and taking photos was just not a thing, you know. And like this idea of having all of those skills and telling stories in a multimedia way hadn't really been done, or was being experimented with. So that is kind of it in a nutshell. Like, and then once I got to Mexico, I really fell in love with Mexico, honestly, and I just felt this very immediate sense of interest and belonging here in a way that I really hadn't either in Malta, where I was born, or in the UK. And you know, when that happens, you just kind of go with it, hold on to it, because yeah, I felt like it was a very natural fit for me, and I was very much into it right from the beginning.
Were there any like disadvantages to being a young foreign reporter who's writing in English and you're coming into Mexico? Was there any resistance from other reporters as far as getting your footing and getting in the door?
Sure. I mean, I spoke decent Spanish when I got here because I'd lived in Argentina for a year, although I had the Argentine accent, much to everyone's amusement. But actually, you know, at the time, there were a ton of foreign correspondents in Mexico working for newspapers as kind of fixed reporters. And instead, at the time, I don't know, I mean, it seemed strategic. Maybe I did it consciously, I don't know. But like I was sort of shooting a lot of video and doing a lot of blogging. And I managed to kind of position myself to work alongside existing correspondents for their media as kind of a digital type person. So I used to do a lot of video for The Guardian. I worked for the AFP news agency for a while, shooting and writing scripts. And the LA Times at the time had the La Plaza blog, which I think is now defunct, but at the time it was kind of a thing, and they were putting money and resources in it, and so I was doing that and working with the correspondents there. So A lot of the time I was sort of complimenting rather than cannibalizing what a lot of the foreign journos were doing. Um, and of course, at the time that I got here was when the then President Felipe Calderon had just launched the drug war. So there were a lot of there was a lot of work. There were a lot of stories. I mean, now the drug war is such old news, and like, you know, editors will be like, did more than 20 people die? No, probably not going to cover it. Like, it's just the ball game is very different to what it was when the violence first erupted. Was it a disadvantage? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I sort of feel like as a woman covering the drug war, yes, you're in the minority, but that can also work in our favor in some ways. And I do consider myself a feminist, but I also consider myself a pragmatist. And I would never be like, oh, I'm not going to go do that story because I'm going to be the only girl, you know, or I'm not going to go do that because they're going to, you know, they're all boys and they're like not, yeah. I mean, a lot of that stuff happened, obviously. But I feel like if you want to make it in journalism, then now I don't even know whether I'd bother, but not because of that. But then you have to be really thick-skinned about it. You know, you can't be sort of holding back because of the things that are standing in your way.
And did you come to Mexico with the idea, you said you studied human rights, but did you have this idea of like working on the drug trade and organized crime from the get-go, or is that something you kind of fell into or moved into?
You know, I didn't come with that intention, but because of the timing and the launch of the drug war in 2006, right from the get-go, organized crime, violence between organized crime and the government, anti-narcotics policy, and all the human rights violations that have come with those dynamics, like the disappeared, the kind of sort of visceral, brutal violence we've seen in Mexico in the last 15 years that was sort of detonated by the Zetas in the early 2000s. All of that happened when I got here. And you know, as you know, like with Mexico, the big stories are the cartels and the drug war and migration mostly, and like trade and politics. But I found myself gravitating much more towards the organized crime story than anything else after sort of getting a taste of it as general news. And in part, that was a decision to go work with a think tank called Insight Crime in around 2016. Which is a journalistic outlet, but also does kind of bespoke in-depth investigations for clients. And so then I had to really go deep and like get a very broad understanding of what the criminal dynamics were in the region. And the thing is, I mean, I kind of feel like once you know a lot about anything, it's super interesting, right? And there's something about certain things that pulls us towards them. The same reason I think people like certain kinds of music and certain kinds of cinema. And for me, it just felt like a very natural progression. I can't say it's because like I've got a black soul or a black heart, you know. I actually think organized crime is a really interesting lens with which to understand the world that we've created for ourselves. You know, I try not to use good and bad anymore because they're just such loaded terms, but we do live in a world that is deeply contradictory and like sort of working against itself in a way. And I think I'm also really interested in narrative, and like there are some very established narratives in organized crime, but there's plenty, it's just so unreported that I felt like it was a really fertile ground for work. You know, when you look at the general news and what they do about organized crime, you know, it's cool, I'm not going to knock it, but it's also quite limited because they're all covering so many other things. And so I have felt, and I always say to journalism students when I talk to them, like, it is good to have a specialism, you know, and that has always kind of served me well.
And did you have a moment though where you thought maybe this is so dangerous of a subject, especially here in Mexico? I mean, it's a big difference to cover organized crime in New York or to cover it in Mexico. In Mexico, as you alluded to earlier, there's can be repercussions, for writers and journalists. Where did you ever have that moment of like maybe a different subject?
I'm not going to compare the US to Mexico, but I don't consider the US a safe place to do much. But
to write, I mean, how many journalists in the US have been killed in the past couple of years?
True. I guess like for me, when I think of the US, I think about sort of the weapons trade and like the mass shootings and the amount of weapons and stuff. And I feel like there is a lot of threat in the US, and especially like now when it comes to journalism and what have you. That said, I actually think the danger to journalists in Mexico is mostly to Mexican journalists. I think my audience is an English-speaking audience that has a very basic understanding of organized crime, unless I'm writing for Inside Crime, whose audience is a lot more kind of wonky and law enforcement biased. But in general, I feel like the people who read my work are a bit like, oh my goodness, I just had no idea. Like, it's not people who live in those places who are going to be outraged at the corruption and the criminality that might emerge in my reporting. I think the real danger in Mexico is to local journalists who are reporting that kind of thing on like federal, state, or municipal government corruption. The sort of narco nexus between organized crime and politicians, or questioning like some of Mexico's like most powerful, richest companies. So you have seen this constant roiling, churning violence against journalists in Mexico, a lot of the time because they're also not very protected by their media owners. So for me, like, I guess I think I'm very privileged in that way, and like lucky that I do not have to make that calculation every day when I leave my house. But also, I think there's perhaps there's a perception of my work being very dangerous, but no reporter goes and covers a story that they don't think they're going to come back from. I mean, let's take away war correspondency, right? Because there's always that risk, and like bad things can happen. But I would never go cover a story thinking, oh, am I gonna, you always do like a really good risk assessment, a lot of pre-interviews before assignments and things like that. Which isn't to say I haven't been intimidated and I haven't been in situations that have scared me and made me sort of wonder what I was doing. But on the whole, I have felt okay. There was some anxiety when the book came out, but we can come to that. And actually, I think NARCAS coming out in Spanish is going to have a very different impact to it having come out in English, because I think the people that can read it are actually people who are people who are in the countries where I went to do the reporting and live in these sort of corrupt, narco-infested ecosystems. So
does that give you any trepidation at all, or
it does?
not?
It does. I have to say, because the book came out in July 2023. I did have some not insignificant pushback from the women. The book is essentially about 6 or 7 women who were connected to the Sinaloa cartel, but very much to the leadership. So, these were women involved in trafficking and transportation logistics, corruption logistics, money laundering. These are not, simply the sort of pretty accessorized women of powerful men. I mean, they were kind of powerhouses in their own right. None of them wanted to speak to me. I asked several times. I interviewed a couple of them, but the majority of them didn't want to speak to me until the book came out. And then they were like, what are you doing?
Wow. So they contacted you after the book came out? So will
And I
the
was
next
like,
version have like some new quotes in it, or?
I mean, I was like, I've been trying to talk to you for 3 years, but okay. I don't know, I haven't really, it's a difficult one, that one, because on the one hand, of course, I'd have loved to speak to them, but now that the book has been in existence for such a long time, and I've had a fair share of sleepless nights and outreach from them, and just like the sort of, I think when you write a book, it's really hard to anticipate how it's going to be received. And I think I underestimated how it was going to be received and what the women were going to think about it. So the idea of getting more quotes and like going deeper and re-reporting everything fills me a little bit with trepidation, sort of opening old wounds, if you like. So, and I can't see, if they didn't want to speak to me for the English language version, I can't see that they're going to want to speak to me for the Spanish language version, which, all of their family and acquaintances are going to read, as opposed to, which isn't to say that people they know don't read English, but like there aren't, it's different publishing a book in English than in Spanish in Latin America. Like your audience is pretty reduced. So
for sure.
Yeah,
I can imagine too. Like it feels so good to finally finish a book and have it complete and go out to the world. Then to have to like go back and rewrite it. I couldn't imagine doing that. Maybe like a sequel, but something new.
Yeah, it's a strange exercise, and I think Planeta really wanted me to kind of redirect it a little bit more towards just Mexico rather than Mexico and Central America, where it currently is at. And I'm in the process of doing it, and it's not like a total overhaul. It's more of an update. A lot of the women who are in the book have since been released from prison, so it's there's continuations of their stories, and also, and I don't know whether you get this when you write, but a book is really just a snapshot in time. And like as soon as the book came out, I'd read it and be like, oh God, I wouldn't say that like that, And so it is kind of cool to be able to go back and take out the stuff that makes me cringe and like realign it a little bit. I don't think it's going to come out again in English though. So
okay.
Only the Spanish speakers or Spanish readers will reap the benefits of that process. If you.
Well, that's exciting. When does it come out in Spanish?
I think it should be in the second half of this year.
Okay.
That's what we're aiming for.
Cool.
So.
I have the book right here. It'll show it up. NARCAS.
So tell me what you thought of it.
The Secret Rise of Women in Latin America's Cartels. I enjoyed it. I read it about 4 or 5 months ago, and I wanted to chat with you back then, but I was just busy with life. And but I really enjoyed it. It was a different, take on. I've never read a book, for example, that focused on female narcas, and what their role is in the cartel, and the different dynamics of the roles that they could play. So just that in itself, gave me a different understanding. I was wondering how you balance this idea of like showcasing women and highlighting women, but at the same time, these women are essentially participating in like narco culture, right? So they're not necessarily like a female astronaut. Like they're doing things that aren't good. And I thought you balanced that dynamic nicely, and like you acknowledge it in the book that you're conscious of it. But I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that while you're writing it, how that played out.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is to do with my interest in narrative generally, and I do think that there is an impressiveness to women who make it in that world without kind of that leading into a glorification. I think you can be impressed and impacted by someone without necessarily admiring or idolizing them, in the way that you can't help but be impressed by some of Trump's like tricks and strategies, even if I sort of despise the results of it. There's a certain skill, I think, to maneuvering and strategy, and I do think for women it's much harder to rise up than it is for men in that world and in Latin America generally. I mean, social mobility and job opportunities in most Latin American countries are very limited for women. So I think that's one thing. I also think that like there is this very kind of black and white narrative, mostly spun by the US, about the drug trade, the good guys and the bad guys and all that kind of stuff. And really a lot of these women get into the drug business by the virtue of the families who are already doing it, or the places that they live. A lot of the women that I featured lived on Central American borders, where in the 70s and 80s, cocaine started flowing north from Colombia on its way to the US. And, that's opportunity knocking. I mean, these communities are, in rural grinding poverty. Most of them make a living, off working the coffee fincas, or, a lot of the, at least 2 or 3 of the women that I focused on were like contraband merchants. So they'd be like smuggling goods across borders to make a better price on the other side. But you smuggle a cow and you make $100. You smuggle a ton of cocaine and you make 800,000. And like I know that maybe to say that's a no-brainer might seem a little tongue-in-cheek, but it does explain to me why so many of those families take that opportunity, because there are very few routes to enrichment and social mobility in Latin America. And if you look at the culture around El Chapo and Sinaloa, as you well know, there's a lot of strength and belief in that rags to riches story, where traffickers who have come from very humble beginnings, El Chapo is the best example, and Escobar, they're these world famous names. El Chapo was in the top Forbes 500, for a period. So I think there is something. It is an achievement of sorts, and I have always been drawn to like the less conventional sort of road to things, and I think there is something very fascinating to me about that world and about how people go into it, especially because we are so sort of warned off it, right? Like a bit like psychedelics in the 90s. It was like, oh my God, try psychedelics and you'll lose your mind. There's kind of, there's no way that anyone could say that they don't know what happens if you get involved in the drug trade, right? Like we all know that for a lot of young people, it's kind of a hard and fast life, and usually ends in death, a violent death or prison. But some people just, choose that over kind of a more pedestrian life, which probably will not enrich them very much because of the attraction of it, as well as kind of the status and power that comes with being involved with those families, right? Like if you look at the families of many of the women in the region, they're kind of a parallel government, especially in those tiny towns. Digna Valle in El Espiritu, which is on the border with Honduras, her family, she was one of 13 siblings, and her family kind of ruled the roost there. They were really the de facto government, and even when the government tried to arrest them, them and their henchmen sort of rose up in arms and were outgunned the government forces. We saw that in Mexico in the last few years too, with El Chapo's son. So it's I can see how that kind of power and that kind of social status is also attractive to a lot of women who otherwise would feel, might feel pretty kind of underserved in that regard. So, I mean, so to answer your question, like, I think if we just, I'm not saying that these people don't understand the consequences of trafficking drugs. They absolutely do. But, they, like governments, are probably the last people interested in legalizing this stuff, because then the whole bottom falls out of the market, right? But they wouldn't really exist without governments and without demand. They are really kind of the visceral representation of the capitalist system of supply and demand. So the idea
because without that risk, they wouldn't be able to make those profits.
Right, and scarcity is important, right? Like the fact that you can only get cocaine in 3 countries in the entire world, you know, and like you need to know how to make it into cocaine. I think all of those factors create a sort of a heady mix that I'm not surprised that people are attracted to. But this idea that they're the bad guys and like the governments are the good guys, and like I just I'm so tired of that, and I don't buy it, and I think it is fascinating to see the interplay between governments and power and organized crime, and you know the public conversations around it, which are so kind of, you know, moralistic in a way, and so it's fascinating to peek behind that and just kind of get a sturdier sense of what's actually happening. And that's what I mean about like not glorifying them, but also not dismissing them as monsters, because I think that's really a very easy thing to do with people who don't abide by the rules. And I think it's way more complicated than that.
Do you think that the rise of fentanyl complicates it morally a bit more? You know, I've always been empathetic to like my local weed dealer. Cool, do your thing. Like, you're not killing anyone. But when you see that like 100,000 people are like ODing every year in the U.S., or you know, just that it's almost not a drug anymore. It's like you're almost just selling poison to the people now. Do you think that complicates how we look at these people?
I think it does. I think it's important to understand the origin of the fentanyl crisis, which came from the pharmaceutical companies. And there's a great line in Ozark. I don't know whether you've ever seen Ozark, but
Yeah,
it's a great series. And there's a point where someone who's based loosely around Chapel meets someone who's based loosely around someone from the Sackler family. And the cartel man shakes the CEO's hand and says, "Oh, it's nice to meet, and it's nice to meet someone who's killed more Americans than we have." You know, so let's not forget where that originated from. And the fentanyl epidemic is really interesting because you've seen a licit substance cycle into being an illicit substance. So some of those overdose deaths were initially caused by legal fentanyl, and that increasingly became illegal fentanyl, right? As you saw the governments clamp down and like China clamp down and what have you. Overdoses for fentanyl are now going down for the first time in a long time for a variety of reasons. I think that might have peaked. But yes, I do think it creates a much more life and death situation. It also shows that prohibition is now probably a moot point, right? Because there's no legal manifestation of like meth and heroin and cocaine, but fentanyl was effectively, you know, a painkiller that's used like legitimately in a lot of medical situations, and started to be abused, a bit like ketamine, but ketamine is not deadly, but like ketamine is now like legally and illegally being consumed in much greater quantities. I do remember there being like a DEA indictment that alleged that the Chapitos were testing fentanyl on, you know, human enemies and human guinea pigs and what have you to try and bring down overdoses. Wow. But, you know, we've seen this before to a lesser extent, right? Drug overdoses have always been a problem, like never to the extent that we're seeing now. I think the thing that's also so like dire about the fentanyl epidemic is how it's killing people from a very broad spectrum of people, unlike the sort of crack cocaine epidemic, right, of I think it was the late 80s, which killed predominantly like impoverished Black Americans, and it just didn't have the same impact for reasons that I'm sure all your viewers understand. But it complicates things in the sense that as long as you have substances that are not regulated, there's always risk to the consumer, right? I mean, people around me have stopped using white powder of any kind without testing it now. Because you can't, even if your dealer is a great guy, he can't guarantee to you what's in what he's selling you unless he's done the honors of testing it for you. So there is a lot
that's one of the scariest things, I think, is that doing fentanyl and not realizing it, thinking that you're doing something else and then having an overdose by a drug that you didn't even think you purchased, that's terrifying.
And arguably, with a mystery for fentanyl has always been for me, and for when I worked at Vice, Max Daly, who's the global drugs editor there, he and I used to talk about this a lot, is it's not really in the cartel's interests to be killing off its customers. And I think what you might be seeing now, sadly, is a consequence of so many fentanyl users have died from overdoses. There's just a like smaller pool of users, and the people who remain are a lot more hip to what the risks are than people were, 3 or 4 years ago. But ultimately, the cartels may have suddenly, the cartels realize that it's not in their interest to be killing people off, and it's probable that there's been a tweaking of the chemical like mix to make sure that that's happening less and less as time has gone on, and they've gotten better at it.
Yeah, it's absolutely not in their interest to kill everyone they're selling drugs to. I mean, the thing with the pharmaceutical companies is a huge, issue. And I've been thinking recently about how, like, the American consumer has, on one end, the cartel bringing drugs across the border, and then on the other end, they have the pharmaceutical companies shoving drugs down their throat. And then they got, big food. Like, there's a bunch of other things all aimed at this American consumer. And I'm thinking, well, why is it the American consumer? And the only explanation I can think is because it's the richest country in the world. So the American consumer has access to US dollars. And so you have a cartel in Honduras, a cartel in Guatemala, a cartel in Culiacan. And they're not selling drugs in their local community. They're all trafficking it up to the American consumer. Do you get any sense, like, in your research, that the cartel kind of views the American as like the other? Like, if they sort of distance themselves from the American person in order to justify selling them drugs?
So I think I'm going to correct you on one thing there, which is that Mexico is a massive consumer of drugs. Latin America is a massive consumer of drugs. For example, meth consumption in Mexico has surged over the last 20 years. Increasingly, as Mexico cartels have consumed meth, it's spread into the local market. I think there used to be an old boy rule that they weren't going to sell meth to Mexicans, but that's been out the window for a long time. The difference is the price. So if you sell drugs in the US that you've produced in Mexico, you're making way more money than if you sell drugs to people who live around the corner. And there's also the taste factor. Like, fentanyl has not taken off in Mexico because you didn't have the initial like pharmaceutical culture of prescribing highly addictive painkillers like you had in the US. Crack cocaine, its biggest market is Brazil. Europe is becoming an increasingly important consumer market now for cocaine, as you've seen. Amsterdam and the Netherlands have had their very own special little drug war with, Moroccan warlords sort of moving in there and taking over the cocaine business. So I think cocaine is diversifying and it's spreading out of the US, and like other drugs are taking its place. Fentanyl epidemics, the likes of which we saw in the US, we have not seen anywhere else around the world. Like, that's a very unique thing. And I think as a trafficker, like, at some point you do have to distance yourself from it, right? At some point, if there's got to be this sort of, I've often thought about it, like, what is the mental calculation that people do where they can like live with that amount of like suffering that they're causing? At the same time, though, I would emphasize, alcohol is an extremely corrosive substance that is totally legal, that costs governments millions, if not billions of dollars a year in healthcare and policing and what have you, and it's a totally legal, okay thing to make a profit from. To me, these are very false divides and you know, creations by us humans to be like, well, it's okay to get drunk and smash up your car and kill people and beat your wife, but it's not okay to get high. You know, that's essentially what prohibition is saying. And I do think there are different types of high, right? Like weed or psilocybin or acid compared to heroin and fentanyl and meth and coke, whatever. Like we could talk about that till the cows come home. But essentially that's the message that we're getting. And essentially that's why, you know, the alcohol companies are like happy-go-lucky corporates and the drug cartels are the worst people in the world. Like those are very, very important distinctions that we have created. Which isn't to say that drugs don't have a huge health risk label, but so do cigarettes and alcohol. And it just so happens that they're not as stigmatized as society as anything else. Arguably, if drug use was not as stigmatized, we'd have less overdoses because, you know, we'd have more of a sense of what we were buying and who we were buying from. But I don't think that's going to happen in mine and your lifetime, so maybe we should move on.
I don't know. I don't see us moving in that direction. But in this sort of like impossible to solve problem with, you know, the U.S. drug problem, Mexico's narco problem, I've yet to hear a better solution than the idea of legalizing drugs. And that would also bring its own problems. So you would have to be very prepared for like rehab facilities and how are you distributing it, and it brings its own set of problems, of course.
I mean, and harm reduction has its problems too, you know, like you've seen that happen in cities across the US where there are certain sectors of cities, right, that are high tolerance and like big on harm reduction, and then that just tends to attract more users, the way you've seen with like homelessness in San Francisco. So you know, as the Buddhists say, our biggest mistake is thinking that we're ever going to be free from suffering. There's always going to be something. There's always going to be a problem. And I think humanity's oldest trades are sex and drugs, right? Prostitution and illegal substances that alter our state of consciousness. And I don't think that's ever going to cease to exist.
Those might be the two jobs that AI doesn't take.
Right. I mean, who knows? And frankly, if AI comes up with a winning solution, I'm all for it. But it's more like we don't want to accept ourselves, and we're constantly resisting and fighting against those desires. When really, I think there are different ways that they could be managed. And maybe in 100 years, we're going to look back at prohibition and be like, what a ridiculous concept. And I don't know, you know, but it doesn't, it's definitely not a problem that's going to go away, not a challenge that's going to go away, whether drugs are prohibited or not, I think, you know, like, I don't know.
Yeah. So when you set out to write Narcos, what were some of the questions you had that you were trying to answer? And was there anything that surprised you along the way?
Well, I was really interested in, I mean, when I was working in covering organized crime for a long time, the women that we saw, really, the only women that we saw were the sort of Emma Coronels, you know, Chapo's wife. So these very, you know, sexualized, glamorous women. You know, Emma Coronel has she's coined this, her very own look, you know, the buchona look, which existed before she did, but has now become part of popular culture on both sides of the Mexico-US border. But I remember thinking, you know, this has to be more complex and nuanced than this. It can't just be that the women in the drug trade are these sort of co-opted wives, you know, some of which may have some initiative of their own, but so when Chapo was Chapo was extradited, I spent quite a bit of time with the documents from that case, and I noticed that one of the names on there was a woman. So I started looking into her. And then as I was speaking to criminal lawyers, they would say, oh, well, have you spoken to this person about this person? And a lot of women just sort of came out of the woodwork, you know. I had to use the US justice system because Mexico's is very opaque. There's really no equivalent to PESA or you know, systems that allow you to really have access to documents about legal proceedings. So I did focus on women who were in the U.S. justice system, so I could actually have some information and write some detail about their cases. And the more I looked, the more I found, and the more I became like increasingly convinced that there were these alternative narratives. And as in the same way that we've seen, you know, football and banking and so many fields that used to be male dominated become very much the territory of women too. I just thought that kind of had to be the case in organized crime as well. And I actually don't know how new it is. I know it's the case now, but I do think women have been there right from the start.
Well, and you mentioned in the book too, there's a certain benefit of sort of being disguised as a woman. People don't assume you're involved in it.
Yeah, I think women are seen as generally a bit more benign than men. I think there's this idea of the woman as, you know, the mother and the nurturer and the peacemaker, not capable of violence. And I think there's something to that in the sense of the socialization process that women go through and the conditioning that we have, right? Which is essentially man is the strong gender and you are the weak gender and you bring these other things, but like you have to not provoke, you have to minimize violence. You know, that's a lot of the conditioning around women. But actually, when you think about the fact that most criminal conflicts now are carried out using automatic weapons and firearms, like really the difference between physical strength and the ability to dominate someone physically is much more of a moot point than it might have been 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And I do think women use those assumptions about them to go under the radar. You know, many of the women I covered, I think only one of them was really not even a household name, but like a DEA office name, like someone that everyone in the DEA might know about. Only one woman, I think, reached that status. Everyone else was very low profile. And they're hip to the understanding that having a high profile in organized crime just isn't really that smart, right? Because if you want to,
yeah, exactly.
You know, if you want to go undetected and like manage things, then you don't want people chasing you or recognizing you wherever you are. I actually would wonder whether people like Chapo and Escobar, I don't know how much they courted media attention, like, because both of them strike me as pretty smart people. And like the more people who know who you are, the badder it is for your business, right? Or like the more implications it has, at least for you as an individual, and your freedom of movement and your freedom of access to things. I mean, you might be very rich, right? But if you can barely leave your house, those are pretty severe limitations, right? And it threatens your business and brings a lot of interest from law enforcement. So
now I wonder if they lose their anonymity a little bit, making their enemies aware of who they are, you know?
Yeah. But I do remember, you remember that Rolling Stone story about Kate the Castillo and Sean Penn when they went in to meet Chapo, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And then Rolling Stone published like a pretty short video of Chapo talking, answering very simple questions. You know, you watch that and you're like, this guy's just a like farmer who's, you know, done pretty well for himself, but essentially I think the media sort of creates these really sort of fantastical people, these like Marvel versions of the cartel bosses. And I'm not sure how much they're really like that. And I'm not sure how much they really want that, you know. I mean, it's a fascinating topic, but I think a lot of what we understand about organized crime and what people are like is based around these kind of Hollywood fantasies, and to a certain extent, like white male journos covering that area and like going in with those assumptions about men and women, and so really focused and dialed in on the men, not the women, which makes it easier for the women to go undetected. But I think all of those factors have a really big impact on how we understand the criminal world in general.
Yeah, everything seems to have the same dynamics of like The Godfather, right? Like that's what every one of our narco movies is like. And I think, like you mentioned earlier, it's one of the reasons people are so interested and enthralled by it. It's because most of us live, pedestrian, normal, relatively boring lives. And then you see The Godfather and you're like, I want to be that guy.
Sure.
Or at least I want to give him 2 hours of my time,
Yeah. And
But the actual life might be a lot less glamorous. It might be a lot different than what we're actually seeing, I'd imagine.
Totally. And there's all this uproar about Emilia Perez. Have you seen that movie? You heard this stuff?
I am getting in so much trouble right now for my opinion on that movie.
Which is, go on.
I liked it. I saw it before I even knew what it was. And so I was just surprised, wow, I've never seen anything like this in my life. This is such a original, weird movie. And I hate musicals. I've never really liked a musical, but I was like, some of these songs are bangers. I like it. So, and then afterwards, everyone I've talked to, they hate it, and with a passion that I'm fascinated by, because it's managed to make everyone on the left hate it, and everyone on the right also hates it.
Right.
And I haven't seen that yet in cinema over the past 4 or 5 years.
It's unusual, yeah. I actually really liked it too, and I felt
finally.
I felt like the criticism, I went in to see it after a lot of the criticism, so I was prepared to not like it. But I don't know whether you remember West Side Story by Leonard Bernstein, the movie. I can't remember when that movie came out, but it felt a bit like trying to use that as a way of seriously understanding the gangs or communities of New York at that time. It's it's, for me, Emilia Perez was an opera as a film set on the stage of the drug cartel business, but that was really as far and as deep as it went. And actually, I really loved, like you, I felt like it had so many original ideas in it, and I loved the idea of a male drug cartel boss wanting to do that, and then the struggles that he has trying to hold on to his family and all that kind of stuff. You saw a very emotional side to a macho male character, be he a police officer or a cartel boss or whatever, which is also very rare to see that kind of sensitivity in at least originally male characters. So I really enjoyed it. And my point to bring that up was that a lot of what we see in Hollywood has absolutely no resemblance to organized crime. And yet, I think people do watch certain things and think that that's what it's like. You know what I mean? But it's just not. Even Griselda, which, dibs to Netflix for doing that project. I think it was very worthwhile and I really enjoyed it. And I think it's very refreshing to have a female lead in a role about the drug trade. But their portrayal of her was way nicer than she actually was in real life. Historians who've documented Griselda Blanco's life, she was killing from the age of 11. She was apparently the daughter of a sex worker. She grew up in an extremely, poor environment in a Colombia that was ridden with violence all over it for political reasons and guerrilla reasons. So
you're talking about Griselda Blanco with the Netflix series that they did on her?
Yes, who's based on really the only super famous female trafficker. Apparently Pablo Escobar once said, "The only man I'm truly afraid of is Griselda Blanco." And apparently she was something of a mentor for him. But the portrayal of her, not only, Sofia Vergara finds it very difficult to look like an everyday woman. I mean, whatever. They tried to dull her down. I don't know how convincing that was. But this idea that she only became violent when she got to Miami. There's this scene where her hands are shaking when she shot someone. I'm like, this woman was a pro by that time. None of this would have come as a surprise or a shock to her system. But I think those edits are also a reflection of what producers and studios feel that the public is prepared to accept. And I think the idea that...
Well, they also need an arc, right?
Yes.
Like if she just arrives and she's a cold-blooded killer, you have no empathy for her. You have...
Right. Or you explain why she's a cold-blooded killer, because she's brought up in like such grinding poverty that she understands that violence is power from a very, very early age. But whatever, there are all sorts of challenges to storytelling, right? And like you have to edit and leave things in, leave things out. But I was really interested in that, and like a lot of the propaganda and like public declarations around Lolo La Chata and La Naja, who were women of color in Mexico, and very powerful in the narcotics business when it was first conceived in the 1930s and 1940s. You saw the discomfort of before wokeness came in, and you had to like sort of stand things in political correctness. Like it was very clear from declarations from the US government how unacceptable it was that there would be women involved in the drug trade, because it totally blows out of the water this idea of women as nurturers and carers and the good gender, and that women would dare to step out of not only socioeconomic and racial expectations but gender expectations too, was kind of disgusting to the authorities. Like, and I think to a certain extent society still has that element to it, which is that they just don't want to see women like that. It's too much. It undermines society to a level at which male drug traffickers don't, because we kind of expect men to be bad and violent and criminal, but not mums, not women.
Yeah, I almost felt that resistance. Like I feel that resistance a little myself, where I'm like, I don't want to think of women as drug kingpins. That just makes it seem like now there's like double the problems. There's the resistance to think like, no, this is predominantly 95% men, and if I'm walking down the street and I see a guy, I have reason to be cautious, but if I see a woman, I'm not afraid. Like that's sort of a natural instinct that we have. So like it comes back to that question of like highlighting female characters who may have not done the greatest deeds in their life, right? But it is a fact, right? They did do it. They exist. Their stories as a journalist should be told in the same way Chapo's stories should be told. And people can interpret that or moralize that however they want. But it's a reality. And if you were working in like law enforcement, then I would think you would want to be very hip to that reality and to understand the complexities of it, and that, maybe that girl at the bar is doing more than just serving drinks. Like this thing could go deeper than you think.
For sure. Like in Colombia, I remember when we were at Vice, we covered quite a few times the sort of scams where a lot of American men go to Colombia to pick up young Colombian women who are famous for being like some of the most beautiful women in the region. And so women are like baiting Americans via the dating apps there, and then drugging them with benzos and robbing them and kidnapping them and that kind of thing. Whether the women are just bait or whether they're running those networks is your guess is as good as mine. But like it is disturbing, and it's weird. Like in the Venn diagram of like, can women be good or bad? Like there is also this very long-standing understanding in popular culture about like kind of the Jezebel, right? The trickster, the sort of the female using her wiles to manipulate man. Like that has always been kind of a string to women's bow in a sense, if we're talking in terms of gender tropes. So in some ways, their like presence in trafficking is really just an extension of that. But I think, I spent quite a lot of time with a guy who teaches women self-defense in Sinaloa, but he's also taught women how to become sicarios or paid killers for the cartels. And it's his belief that once you, as a woman, like once you can get rid of the cocker wash, the conditioning of I am weak, I can't fight back, I'm not going to win. Once you get rid of that, you're as capable as men are of violence. You know, that's very much not sort of a biological fact. And
but don't you think, although you're as capable of it, you're not as efficient at it? I mean, not to say, like, there's women that are bigger than me that would kick my ass, of course, right? But just one man to one woman, men tend to be stronger. You don't want, like, a woman going out and getting in a fight with a man twice her size because she thinks she could, you know, because she knows some jiu-jitsu.
I agree, but my counter to that is, A, if a woman has a gun, whether she's bigger or smaller than you, makes no difference. 2, most killing in the cartel world is outsourced. So I'm not going to do it. I'm going to get my guys or my girls to do it. I'm not doing it myself. And that's the case for Chapo and Escobar and El Mencho. Very few of those men, when they reach the high, the high leadership, are actually pulling the trigger themselves. They're sending people out to do it. It's delegated, you know. So
it's more like this idea that we believe women are, like, incapable of violence. Like, their souls are too good that they won't press the red button on the desk or send out someone to go kill them.
Yes.
To kill other people.
And actually, when you think about the dynamics of family, which are ever present in Latin American organized crime, and the tendency and abilities of women to protect their young, and the fact that most women bring their kids into the drug trade, it makes a lot of sense to me that women use violence to protect their business, which is the same thing as protecting their family. So it makes a lot of sense to me that they master the use of violence in order to meet those objectives, if you see what I mean. Mm-hmm. I mean, I have never been in the drug world, but I can see, like, I can see a world where if you see your people threatened and your business threatened, people who are very close to you, and you have grown up in communities where violence is used as a means to control and dominate, then it's not that big a leap to then start ordering hits on people. You know, I can see how women come to do that as easily as men do.
I wonder, though, this is a little pushback, but I'm curious what you think. If just the evolution of men and women's different roles throughout history have caused men to be inherently more violent. Just the fact that forever we've fought wars and died in wars and been in charge of protecting the family, and so that men may be inherently more inclined to violent crimes than women, and maybe only since, like, the invention of the firearm has there been, like, a level playing field.
Yeah.
You think?
Is that a question?
Is there any truth to that?
I mean,
I think there is some, it's just it's in a thought. What do you think about it?
There is some truth to that, and I also think that's leveled the playing field, definitely. But when I think about my family, which is Mediterranean, and I think about the families around us when we were growing up, and when I think about my friends who are families here, this idea that man dominates and women do what they're told is not it's not an accurate depiction of how families function.
Not in my household.
I mean, not in this house. Not in the house I grew up in either. And the power that women wield may not be violence all the time, but they have a huge amount of influence when it comes to decision making, yes or no, in or out. What are we going to do with this person? How are we going to get that person on our side? Like, women are incredibly powerful and influential in those terms. which of course is related to the use of violence, but they are not the ones meeking out the violence themselves. But there is a power that they have within those ecosystems that's deeply significant. It's just much harder to quantify and understand, right? So if you have someone going out and committing homicides, it's a no-brainer. It's like black or white, good or bad, right? Whereas if you have a woman like Digna Valle, who knows that her brothers are going into the village, taking 13 and 14-year-old girls up to the mansion, raping them, letting the security guards rape them, and then sending them back to their families and telling them if they report it to the police, everyone will be killed. She is a woman who's part of this powerful family, whose brothers are doing that, and she lets it happen, right? She's allowing it because she understands that that is useful because it keeps the village sort of terrorized, right? Is it a nice thing to do? Is she doing the raping herself? No. Is she complicit and perpetuating that power? Yes. And women I spoke to who called Digna out on that said, those girls should know what they're getting themselves into. That's what she said. Wow. She knew it wasn't in her interest to stop it. And that's power. She's making decisions about what to do and her agency and what to use.
Yeah, it really speaks to just the complexity of power in itself, right? This idea that power is just all force and violence, and it's sort of a really simplified idea of power.
It is.
There's all sorts of power.
And I think, some of my favorite movies and narratives are really those that are very nuanced, and I don't think, and I think a lot of that nuance is lacking from some of the sort of Hollywood depictions we see about organized crime. It's why I loved Ozark so much, not just because it has, the women kind of steal the show in Ozark, but also you have a lot of compassion and empathy for a lot of the key characters who are doing bad things. And I think unless you have that, and if you're talking about these kind of one-dimensional bad guys, the one-dimensional bad guy or bad girl is of no interest to me because it just doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel like something I can relate to, because we all know that good people do bad things and bad people do good things. And it's those conflicts and contradictions, I think, that make characters and stories so much richer and more interesting.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, that was one of the reasons I liked Emilia Perez, is because there's just so many movies right now, like another superhero movie, another Superman 8, and the whole dynamic of that is like the good guy, the bad guy, right. The good American superhero is going to destroy the whole world, but he's going to get the bad guy in the process, and it's just sort of this like, I think it's actually really terrible for the culture, because it makes like violence so normalized and almost seem kind of fake. But throughout a movie, the guy's killing like thousands of people, and you bring your kids to watch that, and
it's completely, it's been completely sort of legitimized by Hollywood. But if you really think about it, and there's all sorts of, for women, I remember hearing some podcasts talking about the Wonder Woman movie, and how like there's this scene where Wonder Woman only really loses her shit when they start messing with her boyfriend, and it was like, yeah, you're right. Like there's so much buried in there that's essentially just perpetuating these ideas of like what women are like and what men are like. And I just love narratives these days. You've seen The Wire, right?
Yeah, of course.
Wire. Yeah, that scene where Omar, you find out that Omar's gay, and he's like this black gangster, and he comes out in this dressing gown, and like for me, I was like mind blown by that. Like that character.
Yeah.
In a world where you're just so used to seeing a certain kind of black gangster, a certain kind of white gangster, I was just like.
Yeah.
And
I think that Omar's the best anti-hero of all time.
Like R.I.P. the actor, who did a lot of stuff with Vice as well, but I love those kinds of stories, and like I think that's why Emilia Perez, I liked it, because I'm like, it was so unexpected, and like I do understand the pearl clutching around some of the issues, but I do think we have to be careful about taking some of these things so seriously, like, and wanting them to really reflect reality. The fact of the matter is, that reality exists, and no, I don't think any film about Mexico is really gonna like turn things around. You know, I loved the Sicario movies about Mexico. I loved the Tropo Elite movies about Brazil and the corruption within the Brazilian government. And there are lots of good movies that are actually, I mean, really nuanced, you know, whether they're the ones that like move the needle on policy, I don't know, but
yeah, I think if you're looking for art to like solve the narco crisis in Mexico, like you're starting at the wrong place.
But you know,
it's not really the job of an artist, I don't think, either.
I mean, I feel like as a writer, I'm much more interested now in writing than journalism, or as interested in writing as I am journalism. And one of the projects I'm working on is kind of a novel based very loosely around my world. And I was taking a class with Jennifer Clement. I don't know whether you know her, but she's written a lot of fiction about Mexico. She's a very, very established, wonderful writer.
Jennifer Clement?
Clement, yeah. She wrote Prayers for the Stolen and Gun Love. She writes a lot of fiction based on Mexico's sort of landscape, criminal landscape. And she was giving us a workshop, and she said, you know, Oliver Twist, when it came out, did change government policy about you know, kids working and homelessness and stuff like that, which I didn't know about, and like it made me think I need to read more about how fictional narratives can impact society's perception of things and like instigate change or whatever, because I've always thought that was really the premise of journalism and documentary filmmaking.
The Jungle is another book that was really important.
What's that?
It's about Chicago meat packing plants in like the 20s or 30s, but just the horrible conditions there.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And increasingly, as facts become completely irrelevant I feel like facts these days are matters of opinion. You know, facts don't really matter anymore.
Why do you think journalism has been taking such a hit?
I mean,
recently,
the internet broke the journalism model, right, about 25 years ago. And I think we've been struggling ever since. And I think we have a lot of foundations and like entrepreneurial and philanthropic money that's holding up a lot of journalism. We may see a lot of that start to disappear as we move into the Trump administration. But also that, because Trump has turned that whole thing on its head. Like, it's really not about facts anymore. It's really about like, it's a political game, if you like, and it's really about being a character and an avatar, and like, you know, when you look at what's been happening in the US the last few weeks, you know, it's completely, it speaks so poorly of like this system of law that the US has built, you know, so proudly and so famously, and like it's being completely disregarded. You know, there's no accountability. The executive orders that are coming out of the White House read like Hollywood scripts. You know, they issued an executive decree about the cartels and the total elimination of the cartels. It's like, okay, but it's language that really doesn't have much basis in reality, you know. And I think facts as such are becoming less relevant. And I also think narrative can take the same facts and produce very different stories, you know. Like,
or what facts you leave out in your narrative.
Yeah, and like narrative is everything these days, you know. So I don't know, journalism is suffering a lot because I'm not sure facts are the point anymore. They should be, but they just aren't. It's just much more nuanced than that now.
Who would be in charge in like an ideal world in checking the facts? Because I know like the Biden administration did a lot to sort of check the facts but some of the facts that they were checking turned out not to be facts, right? And then you have the issue of government censorship, and it starts to feel very Orwellian. One example would be like, we couldn't say that the coronavirus, probably came from the Wuhan lab, right? Online, without being kicked offline. So I guess the question, in like an ideal world, who's checking these facts?
I mean, the concern for me is less whether the facts are true or not. The concern for me is that for example, what we're seeing on migration, right? The fact of the matter is migrants come from Honduras and Nicaragua and Venezuela because there's zero governance or rule of law in their countries, right? So cutting aid to all of those countries, it's a no-brainer to understand that that's really gonna only make matters worse, right? If things are getting worse in the source countries that migrants are coming from, making life in those countries worse is not going to help. But they don't care. That my point is more like, you can diagnose the problem, but they're more concerned with like actions that are going to get them applause in American cities from people who don't really understand what the problem is. Do you see what I mean? Like, so it's less a point of like, are these things true? And more a point of, yes, these things are true, but they still don't care, or it still doesn't matter. It still doesn't mean that they're going to create solutions and policies that actually tackle the problem. Do you see what I mean? And that's the thing with the cartels and like the to and fro with Trump and Shenbaum. Like, it all just feels like theater. Like, none of it feels really based in reality, you know, tariffs and, you know, what they're going to do. And like, we saw this when AMLO came into power. So then Trump says something and then they smoke the peace pipe and then everyone's happy. But like, everything is carrying on as it was.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
I think a lot of it is theater, you know, and like, you saw how the tariffs played out in a couple of days where it's like, no, we'll push them back a month. So I think there's a lot of just negotiating and theater tactics that are going on. But I guess I'm more curious about like how we're in this age where there's so much information, there's misinformation, there's artificial intelligence coming in and creating videos that aren't real. So like how we're going to go about trying to determine as individuals like what is real and what isn't, what is a fact and what isn't. I think
that's a good question.
Yeah, I think though we've seen like people lose faith in traditional journalism to a large extent and turn to alternative platforms like Substack, for example. What do you think about like Substack and some of these alternative ways of doing journalism?
I have a Substack, and I think the challenges of platforms like that is you have to put a lot into it unpaid before it starts paying off. And for people who are busy and not rich, it's very hard to do that. It's very hard to justify it. Or you find other means of income, right? And that's your labor of love for a year or two, and you build up a following or whatever. I think it's hard for journalists on Substack because you have to be really trustworthy if you're not backed by an existing journalism brand. I think you see that happening more and more. But there's also sort of, you know, the mass appeal of like people like Joe Rogan, and who I wouldn't count as a journalist. I think his value is in his guests, maybe, and he has, you know, I know a lot of...
Yeah, I don't think he would consider himself a journalist either.
And I've seen a lot of people on his show who are smart and who do understand what they're talking about, you know, and who I would trust. But I don't know. I feel like there is so much now in terms of journalism that even if you spend months on something, it comes out, people talk about it for about 7.5 seconds, and then they move on to the next thing. You know, it's like public conversation has become so fast-paced and so vicious. I'm just not sure that, you know, we're not stopping wars like that photograph by Nick Ut during Vietnam. You remember that black and white picture of the naked kids running after getting scarred by napalm, which is credited with essentially bringing the Vietnam War to an end. We just have so much information now, and so much opposing, conflicting information, that I just don't think it has that like profundity and impact anymore. Which isn't to say we don't need it, but it's a different creature than it used to be.
Yeah, I agree. And it's not like something you could put the genie back in the bottle. I mean, it's just a completely different landscape.
It is. And with AI coming, you know, and like the lamentation by a lot of people in the rights community about AI, I'm like, I get it, but it's coming. And like, there's really nothing. It's like a tsunami, and it's like the internet, and it's like social media. There's nothing you can do to stop it. So really you have to understand how to use it and like limit the sort of negative exposures you have to it and your loved ones have to it. But like the idea that we're going to stop it, it's not realistic, you know?
No, for sure. All right, I have 2 quick questions for you, and then we'll get out of here.
All right.
Tell me a little bit about how it's been going with the book. Like, what are some of the things that you like doing? Do you like doing book readings? What are some of the things that are working for your marketing? What isn't?
It's been going really well. I've had like a lot of these kinds of interviews with people who like think and enjoy alternative conversations. It hasn't been like a massive hit like a Don Winslow book or anything. I think because it actually doesn't scratch the itch a lot of people have of like just wanting to read about buchonas. Like that's such a small part of the narrative. It did have a lot of interest, and I did have a lot of conversations with Hollywood and like podcast producers and stuff. And you know, things may or may not come of it. I'm kind of just letting things unfold the way they're going to. I think a lack of access to the women has been a huge problem in terms of a documentary film, but I am having conversations about some scripted possibilities around it. And you know, it's weird. I sort of pick it up and put it down. Like sometimes I'm super enthused about it, and sometimes I'm like, I just want to move on. You know, I oscillate a lot because it is quite a heavy topic at times. And I've had a lot of interest from academics too, which has been really gratifying. And I've gone to a lot of events in Latin America to do with women and criminality. I went to Southcom and like spoke to 50 people from the US military, one of which was a woman, about this. After which someone asked, "Oh, so how do we solve this problem?" I don't know what to tell you.
That's the sequel.
I mean, you don't really solve this problem, but like it's good to have you be aware that it's even a problem, you know. But it's been very.
That's usually when I get into like arguments with friends over a couple beers. After like an hour, we just go like, "We're not gonna solve this problem."
And maybe we're silly to think that we are, but it has like coincided with a time in my life where I am realizing the sort of fundamental importance of perception and how we see what we expect to see. We manifest what we, you know, our greatest fears, and then they become real. Like all of these like larger philosophical questions that I find really interesting that came out of doing the book too. So I have found it really fulfilling, and like, you know, just writing a book, it's really hard, and it took a really long time, and like took a lot of dedication and discipline, and that alone feels like having run a marathon of sorts. You know, it did give me a lot of satisfaction.
Absolutely. Well, congratulations. It's great that you have it out there.
I'm glad you read it.
Yeah, for sure. Me too. All right. Last question for you.
Sure.
Do you have any advice for young writers?
Young writers? Yes.
Yeah.
I do have so much advice for young writers. Maybe enough to fill another interview, but if I could give you a few, I'd say you cannot be a writer without being a reader. You have to write. You have to read voraciously, and I mean journalism and non-fiction and fiction, and you have to be able to sort of observe the world and like construct these kind of imaginary things in your writing. But also I do think writing is also like any other muscle, like you have to do it every day, and you know, the longer you don't, the more you're kind of starting from scratch, you know. So I think if you want to be a writer, you have to be writing every day, and even if that's, you know, a romantic WhatsApp to your lover, or, you know, an email to your mum in a faraway land, like there is a craft to everything that we write, whether it's a book or a poem or a letter or a message. Like, to be considered, to be considered in the way that you write is to be considered in the way that you think, you know. And I also feel like as a writer, you one of the most important things you can do is really, and I keep saying this to my kids, is like, you have to let go of the concern of what people are going to think, or like, you cannot be editing yourself too much. And that's not because art is just for you. I do feel like writing is, its value is that it's consumed by other people, right? It's not just something that you do for yourself. It is something that teaches the world something. But in order to do it to the best of your capabilities, I think you have to really like learn to let go of that self-consciousness, which is a lifetime project. You know, I think you do have like the Stephen Kings and the, you know, these very prolific, successful writers, but they are the exception to the rule. I don't think it happens that easily for most of us. But it does require like discipline and self-mastery, basically.
Beautiful. Deborah, thank you so much. Everyone, check out the book, NARCAS. Get it. Where can people buy the book?
Amazon mostly, and Barnes and Noble, and like most online booksellers have it. And the Spanish edition should be out, I think, like towards August, something like that. And that they should be able to get in most bookshops. They can get it in Portuguese in Brazil as well. That just came out as well. If you've got any Portuguese viewers.
I don't know how big my Portuguese audience is, but I'll let them know.
All right.
Awesome. Hey, thanks so much for talking with me. I really appreciate it, Deborah.
No worries. It was really fun. I'll speak to you soon.
Have a good night. Talk soon.
Bye.
Bye.